Welcome to the final literary reading in an extraordinary benefit series, Pieces de Resistance, celebrating Alaska Quarterly Review's 40th anniversary. There will be a coda next week, but I'll let AQR editor Ron Spatz preview that at the end of the hour. I'm Heather Lindy, and on behalf of the Center for Narrative and Lyric Arts and our hosts, the Anchorage Museum at Rasmussen Center, thank you for being here today. Gunashchish, as we say where I live, on the banks of the Chilkat River in Haines, Alaska, the homeland of the Tlingit, Jilkat Kwan, and Jilkut Kwan. I'm grateful to be here. Since October, we've spent just about every Sunday with some of the finest writers around, from Amy Hempel, Naomi Nye, and Ciara Freeman, to Celeste Ng, Camille Dungy, and Jill Osier, Tracy Kidder, Dorian Locks, Jane Hirschfield, Liz Bradfield, and even Bonnie Nadzum in her car in a vivid mother, poet, small apartment, pandemic only moment. Victoria Chang, who will be at the virtual Kachemak Bay Writers Conference in Homer in May. You can still sign up. And Nancy Lord, Peggy Shoemaker, Lance Twitchell, Emily Wall. I mean, every single event really for me has been astonishing, enlightening, inspiring, and it's all been a wonderful bridge from hopefully this last winter of the COVID-19 plague to the springtime of relief and new beginnings and positive change. And a reminder of how much we need writers and poets in hard times, as well as a celebration of Alaska Quarterly Review, the influential literary journal that has published them all. And we have actually surpassed our fundraising goal of $15,000, which is also terrific. So thank you. Of course, a little extra always helps, so please consider a donation today. And you can find recordings of this hour and of all the previous programs at our website at aqreview.org and our YouTube channel. And today, in celebration of the 25th anniversary National Poetry Month, we have 4 poets: Virginia Konchan, Heather Treseler, Alyse Knorr, and Kate Partridge. And now I'd like to introduce Ronald Spatz, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Alaska Quarterly Review. Ron's a professor of English and a founder of the Honors College and Office of Undergraduate Research at the University of Alaska. He's a former National Endowment for the Arts Fellow and the recipient of 2 Alaska Governor's Awards and a Contribution to Literacy Award from the Alaska Center from the Book. His work has appeared in a wide range of journals and anthologies, including New Letters, Fiction, the Transatlantic Review, the Little Magazine in America, Spreading the Word, Editors on Poetry, and The Whole Story, Editors on Fiction. Under his 4 decades of leadership and vision, Alaska Quarterly Review has made really strong connections between Alaska and the larger literary community in the United States and abroad, as today we've got Canadians with us. And under his 4 decades of leadership, we've also promoted new and emerging writers, as well as presented works that include a rigorous questioning of larger societal issues. Plus, thanks to Ron's insistence, there's always a distinctive photograph on the cover. Ron.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. And thank everyone for joining us. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. Before we begin, I need to make a few important acknowledgements. Alaska Quarterly Review gratefully acknowledges the Anchorage Museum for hosting and providing all of the technical support for this event, and Web 907 for its web support of Alaska Quarterly Review, and the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes this event possible for Alaska Quarterly. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. AQR is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional, present, and future caretakers of this land. Land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of indigenous peoples, and marks our collective movement toward decolonization and equity. As Heather said, we are so delighted to close out our National Poetry Month series of events with Virginia Konchan, Alyse Knorr, Kate Partridge, and Heather Treseler. Joining me today is Heather Lindy. Heather is the author of 4 books, all published by Algonquin. If you lived here, I'd know your name. Take Good Care of the Garden and the Dogs, Find the Good, which is this year's Alaska Reads book, and her recently published Of Bears and Ballads. And now to begin, I send it over to Heather.
Thank you, Ron. And it's my pleasure to introduce our poets today. And I'm going to get to it because there's 4 of them, and I'd like to hear from them more than us. So Heather Tressler is Associate Professor of English at Worcester State University in Worcester, Mass., where she teaches creative writing and American literature. She has a BA from Brown and a PhD in English from Notre Dame. Her poems and essays have appeared in Harvard Review, Boston Review, Iowa Review, Southern Poetry Review, Notre Dame Review, Boulevard, the Worcester Review, the Weekly Standard, and of course, Alaska Quarterly Review, among other journals. She's received the Frank O'Hara Poetry Prize for Voyeur in June and was a runner-up for the Editor's Prize at the Missouri Review. Her essays about post-war American poetry also appear in Reading Elizabeth Bishop, an Edinburgh Companion, John Berryman, Centenary Essays, Elizabeth Bishop in the 21st Century, the Salt Companion to John Matthias, and Dunstan Thompson on the life and work of a lost American master. She's a recipient of Worcester State's George Alden Award for Excellence in Teaching and received support from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She has a particular affinity with a name that also has Worcester roots, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Worcester-born poet Elizabeth Bishop. She's written several essays about Bishop, as well as her doctoral thesis at the University of Notre Dame, and had a residency at Bishop's grandparents' house in Great Village, Nova Scotia. She says, Bishop's work has always been a magnet for me. And Alyse Knorr is the author of the poetry collection Copper Mother, Annotated Glass, and Mega City Redux, winner of the 2016 Green Mountains Review Poetry Prize, and 4 poetry chapbooks. Her work has appeared as well in Alaska Quarterly Review, as all of our guests have, Denver Quarterly, Columbia Poetry Review, the Greensboro Review, and Ziziva, among others. She's co-editor of Switchback Books and an assistant professor of English at Regis University. Alyse Knorr is also the author of Super Mario Brothers 3, all about the video game and more, with the help of her friends and family, critics inside and outside the realm of gaming. She unearthed Super Mario Brothers 3 connections to theater, Japanese folklore, and her own princess rescuing impulses. Alyse Knorr, who says, teaching plays a big role in inspiring her creative work. Teaching, she says, stimulates the mind and keeps you intellectually alert, which is so important for writing. It forces you to keep your habits of observation, critical thought, and questioning all fine-tuned every single day. Kate Partridge is the author of the poetry collection Ends of the Earth, a book about Alaska, of which Sarah Ann Wynn wrote in the Kenyon Review that the cumulative effect reminds us not only of Alaska's isolation from the rest of the world, but of our common fragile journeys. Kate Partridge is an ideal pathfinder, giving us glimpses of the shore and reminding us of the transient nature of life here at the edge of the abyss. She's also written the hybrid chapbooks Guide to Urban Reindeer and Intended American Dictionary. Her poems have appeared in Alaska Quarterly Review, Field, Yale Review, Pleiades, Michigan Quarterly Review, Blackbird, and other journals. And she lives in Denver, where she teaches at Regis University and co-edits Switchback Books. Kate Partridge, who said, I really prefer to let the poem shape emerge as I write. I think this is part of, for me, preserving the poem's spontaneity. I want it to tell me what it should look like. And Virginia Konchan is the author of the poetry collection Any God Will Do, which John Emile Vincent has called urgent and whip smart, and says that each poem opens like shaken champagne. She's also written The End of Spectacle, a collection of short stories, Anatomical Gift, and 3 chapbooks, Empire of Dirt, The New Alphabets, and Vox Populi. She's the co-editor of Marbles on the Floor, How to Assemble a Book of Poems. Her work has appeared in Alaska Quarterly Review, The New Yorker, Best New Poets, The Believer, The New Republic, Kenyon Review, Boston Review, Story Quarterly, Joyland, and elsewhere, and been anthologized in several collections. Her honors include grants and fellowships from, among other places, the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Vermont Studio Center. She lives in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where she works as a freelance writer and editor and as an instructor for the Writers' Federation of Nova Scotia. Virginia Konchan, who is a first-generation Lithuanian and says history carries with it a kind of creative DNA. Quote, through their arts and literature, Lithuanians used code. Devils and pagan creatures represented these dictators, and they told stories of folktales that conveyed a forbidden meta message. So she writes, I believe the sense of being an outsider in your own space carries down via generations through the soul. And now we will begin with our first presenter is Heather. Thanks for being here. Heather, wait, stop. I can't hear you. I don't know if I'm the only one, so I just want to make sure. Is anybody else having trouble hearing Heather, or is it just me?
Am I audible now?
You're on.
Yes, now you are.
Okay.
Good, we want to hear you.
Thanks, Heather. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and a very warm thanks to Ron Spotts, who's been an early champion of my work and of all of our work here. When I was in college, I worked at the Brown University Library on the weekends and read through the literary journals from A to Z, which put Alaska Quarterly, of course, high on that list. And I have to say, it set a very high bar for what my sophomoric imagination thought a literary magazine could do, such that I kept coming back to it both throughout college and after. And it took me about 20 years to appear in AQR, but I was very excited to do so just 2 or 3 years ago. And I'll start by reading 2 poems that first appeared in AQR and then subsequently appeared in my first book, Partridge, which came out just as COVID was sort of shutting the world down. And this first poem is called Call, and it makes reference to a membrane that an infant can be born with. It's an extraordinarily rare phenomenon, but it's one that's often associated with prophecy or powers of divination and foresight. And it first appeared in AQR. Call. You are 6 times more likely to be twice struck by lightning than born with an amniotic sac scarved about your head. Child of the veil, the old ones said, their old world membranes broken by necessity in New Canaan. Born in Call, she is not holy or haunted, not friend to prophets or ghosts inherited, but stirred by life's bright brashness, its carousel sights that beg for sound. As on an afternoon in late October, the ochre light of famishing gold, a woman carries a harp across her back and turns to face traffic, her profile like a wyeth in an aqueous meadow in Maine. She bears the instrument of her making, walks as if steered by its inaudible weight. What remains hidden in portage, the dearth before melody, the blind birth of song. When I first shared this poem actually with Virginia, she told me that she's actually in the extraordinarily small cohort of people who were actually born in Call. But if you know just how special a person and a poet Virginia is, that completely makes sense. But it was a poem that I wrote in part thinking about how strange it is sometimes to be an artist and to be trying to bring into vision for other people what it is that you see. This next poem is from a different sequence. It is in my first book, and it first appeared in AQR. And it's called Anhedonia, which is actually another clinical term. It means an inability to feel pleasure. And it's often found in people who are mourning, in fact. So this poem in my book serves as a kind of epilogue to a very long sequence of elegies. Anhedonia. What now to pair with bread? After you died, I could not think of what to eat, riddling illogic to every flavor, a revulsion to the idea of taste or savor in the bitter winter after the coroner had ratified with sterling knife, you hadn't meant to die. No conclusive evidence of self-harm, his voice procedural, calm. Still, it seemed you had made a deliberate gift of the shriven, sunken lake of your bluing body, your mermaid legs that had not moved for 20 years, steel rods that held your spine upright. Sacrifice, pyre, when they slid you from table to fire, giving you back to vapor and ash, flame took the henna'd auburn hair where I had always buried my face. Your body, your bread, paired from me, unpaired. And I stood there naked, raw for shelter, each woman's house built on the long bones and breath of another. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and read 3 new poems, 2 of which are forthcoming in journals, and one which is about as recent as a week ago. There's been a lot in the news lately about Alfred Hitchcock, because there's a great new biography of him, and it reveals a lot of interesting details about his life. And this poem is called Hitchcock in the East End, and it takes place when Hitchcock was about 10 years old. His parents went out to dinner, but forgot to tell him that they were doing so. And he woke up and found no one was there. So as we think about the things that made Hitchcock afraid, this is one scene that comes to mind. Hitchcock in the East End. The feel of meat between the teeth soothed his panic or flavored it. At night he woke and found his parents not at home, no note or neighbor with news of whereabouts, no siren or scene of disorder. Kitten heels, derby hat, missing from the closet. With bovine violence caromming into the kitchen, he began eating slice after slice of corned beef and tongue, something to assure himself he was still animal, boy, creature who eats another, teeth gnawing at grist and grease, wolfing fear before it consumes, proving himself Alfred, pale in an icebox fluorescent glare, its celluloid flash of light. During COVID, I've been thinking a lot about the suburbs and domestic spaces, since that's where I've been for the past year and a half, and about the kind of psychic landscape that the suburbs represent. This next poem is called Anne Sexton. She's, of course, a poem from my own hometown, where I now live. She resided here in Newton and cut quite the figure. So this is about her. Anne Sexton. Suburbs, like braziers, shape and contain their contents, wire under lace, seamliness and seams along the wildness of woods, except for the renegade deer or tom turkey, who struts straight down the thoroughfare. Suburbs, like musical theater, lend everyone role and song in sitcoms between commercials. The point is repetition. The point is novelty, delimited to the height of a privet hedge, a hidden affair. How stark the coordinate machines of the city, its concrete floors and carapaces of new money. Whereas suburbs are seersucker and silk hose, demi-tasse or highballs on the shaded porch. In the bedroom, late afternoons, I watch crenellations of light mount the ceiling, take its white blankness hungrily. Cotton sheets accept the skin of a woman surviving her despair who broils a Sunday roast, prattles behind a pram, fusses about collar starch and geraniums while she writes of her madness, masturbation, men, menstruation. The point of the living room is stilled life. The point of the kitchen is producing for the reproducing. But I am the feral creature who wanders the street, peering in windows, wide-eyed, alert, not a stitch under her skirt. And I think I'll conclude there and turn it over to the next reader. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Heather. And our next reader is Alyse.
Thank you so much, Heather, for that beautiful introduction. And thank you to Rebecca, the Anchorage Museum, and of course, Ron and AQR for having me today. I'm so grateful for the existence of AQR, a journal that inspires me constantly in my reading, and that I was so lucky to meet Ron during my time living in Alaska, and so I'm grateful to Ron for his friendship and mentorship too. Beautiful reading, Heather. It's an honor to read with three poets who I admire so much, at least one of whom I'm married. So it's always a delight, and Heather, that was just beautiful reading. So I'll start with a poem that was published in AQR a few years ago called Floating Epithalamium. An epithalamium is a poem that celebrates a wedding. In the forests I have known, boreal, pine, kudzu, new and mint, glinting, fallen, dry, or torn to ground, dirt-caked ancient roots pointing up to sky and space. Black bear, ptarmigan, jackrabbit, and once a coiled copperhead your foot landed inches from crushing. Forest of poisonous leaves and ticks, Red Clay Creek and its sweet muddy water, tadpoles sprouting miraculous back legs in the hot, wet earth. Childhood forest of patio table forts, where boards nailed to bark made lookout towers, and the neighbor's hounds snuffled below, circling in wait. Forest where airplanes land. Forest where moose birth their calves in the sunny night. Forest my father made with his bare hands. Toccoa Forest, where slow rain once woke me in a flatbed, and I knew your precise location on earth. You when I was young and nameless. You when the hounds howl and the trees fall. You in the before. You in all the years to come. And I think I'll read just one more poem that takes place in Alaska. This poem makes reference to a really exciting hike that I took with a couple friends in Alaska that resulted in us getting charged by a moose and sort of having to run down into a ravine to take shelter. It's called Rabbit Lake Trail. Across the milky wilderness you stuck to my barbed wire back. The map read names like Suicide Peak and Powerline Pass. Released from his leash, the dog bolted for a covey of ptarmigan that seemed miles from where I stood. He ran from me to the birds and back again, an ecstasy of ptarmigan and mountain and the trail along the ridge. I thought only of how I might describe this to you, and later, when I learned the true name, invisibleness, for a group of ptarmigan. I thought of what Calvino said about love as a matter of precision. And then I thought of how I might describe you to myself in another year. Which details might remain. When the grazing moose spotted me, I broke for the ravine, scrambled down rocks, and looked up to the bull clopping fast along the valley's chute, and even then you did not subside. You were an instrument of accuracy, not precision. How to explain? On the radio today, a song about running to Alaska to shake a long bad dream. We tell ourselves, do not romanticize the landscape. Yet there, in the glacial carved basin, spruce gave way to scrub and tundra, and the willows began to heal themselves, even before the moose was out of sight.
Alyse, we're having a little trouble hearing you.
Okay.
You need to turn up your sound.
How's this? Is this better? Awesome. Okay, I'll read a couple poems that I've written since the pandemic started. This one I wrote in April 2020 when I thought we were in the middle of the pandemic. I've since changed the title. So this is called At the Beginning of the Pandemic. I keep typing power flu when I mean to type powerful. So powerful, the free opera streams. So powerful, the Navy ship treading to Manhattan, my students inventing words. After when, Light Marsh, one renames herself Golden Bird. And I am thinking of you, lost friend, you in the new Pacific mountains and the wrought iron herb garden. You for whom love is grief, and truth a weapon you hand the enemy. Barbed like the spores of a virus, infectious and exponential. Will I ever touch you again? A biologist calls me asking for meaning. I write in my garage until a neighbor pulls down the door. Who am I to exist? By what right? We're all going to catch it eventually, you say, and I want to take your head in my hands. I was supposed to be wiser, but this notion of deserving, to live, to breathe easy. After when I find my soul again, after when I know what to say. O you, O dear one, O precious careful salve, you for whom love is a demand, whose name is an incantation, you whose name I cannot say at all. The letter planes are all grounded, and in this long Sabbath month, what words do we utter but prayer? So I've been thinking a lot about my yard this past year because that's kind of the extent to which I can explore my environment. And so this next poem is about gardening, trying to keep plants alive while also trying to keep a very young infant alive. And all these things have gotten me thinking a lot about death. So this poem has an epigraph by Jia Yongming that says, all who have stood in a mother's hand are sure to die because they were born. Quiescence. Between us bobs the baby, solemn in her infant wetsuit. The pool is the only place where screaming does not indicate terror. The neighbors' pansy beds, oh, to lie down in those beds and doze. Greener than grass, says Sappho, originator of envy. My sleep is pollinated by the baby's wails, dreams sprouting voices in peril, mind sped up and emaciated like a greyhound in the track. The end of growth is death. The painting begins with a scribble, or is a scribble the finishing touch? Call your plants by their names, 10,000 words a day. We feed, we weed, we read her books about owls. What am I minding but stillness? What have I grown except loss? This next poem is also about my lawn. It's called Reading 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird to the Dead Blackbird on My Lawn. To call down the gods in their town cars, to alert the sky of its failures, to do myself a kindness, to stuff the soft feathers in my mouth, to gaze through the flies at the open eye, to find the body both graceful and clumsy, to erase the corpse by describing it, to etch the corpse in pen, to harbor the corpse in my arms, to reach my quota of lies, to cast a spell on my lover, to tell myself a story, to put something back where I found it, which is not to say I returned it. I'll just read you two more poems here. The first is another poem about parenting in the pandemic. And the 8 o'clock howls that get mentioned in the middle are from back at the beginning of the pandemic, when we would all go outside our houses and howl every night at 8 p.m. as a sign of solidarity. So this poem is about my 2-year-old, and it's called Constitutional. Where girl newly walking stumbles in her Velcro shoes toward the zombie tulips, awakened Jesus style for 1 week only. Uh-oh, she says as she dumps her plastic eggs again. Uh-oh, she mutters, replacing them one at a time. The 8 o'clock howls wake her nightly from her toddler dreams. Baby Bell cheese and a dog-eyed view from the stroller. Or nightmares. A glass she is not permitted to touch. A gate between her and the kitty's tail. O child of the quarantine, comforted only by sticking your whole arm down my beer glass. What delights will transfigure you today? What new words will you swallow whole? And I'll close with a poem that I wrote for the graduating class of 2020. My students who didn't get to have their graduation last year in 2020. And so I'll just go ahead and dedicate it to the graduating English majors of 2021 this time around. Commencement. When once we would have gathered on the grass in the champagne sun, when once I would have embraced you in our awkward medieval robes, when once I would have looked in your eyes and told you to cease now calling me professor, what I offer instead are words, though not merely, for haven't we feasted on this meal together, coaxing meaning off a page? Were we not made family by language or the hope of what it contains? Words the shortest way home, moonflowers lining life's paths, looking on tempests unshaken. I see you now, graduates, through the screen of my window, the window of my screen. You are weathered as today's snow, bright as tomorrow's sun. I have never loved you more. Dear ones, we taught you to save the world, not knowing how soon we'd need it. The future comes not kindly, but is coming nonetheless. Beloveds, as you sail through this to that, fill anew your paper with the breathings of your heart. With your own 2 hands, you have built worlds and philosophies. Let me borrow from them now. Let me inhabit your hope, and let me be your student, learning again the lesson you taught me first 4 years ago. You, perched in the back of my classroom, believing that words can mean, believing so well in belief. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Alyse. That was wonderful. And Kate is next.
Thank you. Thanks to Ron and Heather for that lovely intro, and to Rebecca and Cody and everybody at the Anchorage Museum, where I have many fond memories of attending readings with 49 writers and being in community with some of you up there. So thinking of that space here, even as we're sort of dispersed in Zoom. I am so honored to be here reading on behalf of AQR, you know, a legend in its own right, truly. Was very lucky when I lived in Anchorage for a few years to be able to attend some of the launches at the Taproot, right, which once was, and to be in that space of sort of celebrating the issues coming into the world. And it's exciting to be able to do that in sort of another forum here as AQR transitions. So thanks so much for having us, Ron, and thank you to Virginia and Heather and Alyse for making this such a fun group to be reading with. So I'm going to read a few poems from a new manuscript of mine, which sort of sits between eco-poetics and the meditative tradition. And they're poems written over the last few years in which I've been moving from Alaska to California to Colorado. And so they're sort of poems that are scattered all across the West. And I'm going to read you 4 of them, one of which appeared in AQR. 2 have dinosaurs. They were written 2 years apart, so I think that maybe that indicates just a fixation. But that's the only prediction I'll make for you. All right, so the first one is called Fanfare for the Dinosaurs, or The Trumpeter. And it responds to a painting by Agnes Martin that's called Untitled, and parenthetically, Innocence. As if I had done a thing to deserve it, this delight. The afternoon air is filled not only with the usual clatter of mountain spring, the paving trucks dragging their stomachs along the newly milled curb like seals headed up the beach, the nickel hail flipping across the aluminum porch's broad sun hat, but with the blowing of a young trumpeter who, by afternoon, has already worn right through someone in the house and finds herself rehearsing in the yard. Nothing is ejected from my walls. Not railroad spikes, antlers found prone, stone fragments printed with fossilized ferns. For Agnes, innocence is 6 pale bars. She's always wearing stripes, which leads one to wonder whether the work influenced the shirts or the other way around. The one woman in the English Royal Trumpeting Corps wears a coat resembling a pile of rugs. Some things are not worth it. The trumpet has no particular location to speak of, not like the next door post-it entreating us to please return the rake. She takes us all with her into the air. She knows 3 entire songs. One is a fanfare. I'm hoping it provides a general good, as it has already done for me. Not far from here is a hillside where people figured out that standing between 2 rocks could project their sounds in a perfect acoustic balance, suggesting, as we like to believe, that things were made with our weird little voices in mind. And just below are the footprints of dinosaurs who hiked straight up the hill's face. Touching them did not make them seem more real. They remained in my mind like something printed from a textbook image, too precise with their curving toes to be so antique. The trumpeter forever returns to her calling card from Jurassic Park. This is not an adventure park, unless you count the ducks who like to leave their enclosure and take to the sidewalk in protest. They're insecure or unsecured. The trumpeter, maybe, is seeding us all with little bulbs of rebellion, the music entering our habits like misplaced grenades. A balloon you've forgotten that pops at the top of the staircase in the night. No one's measured stripes fall outside the range of the comets. The white horse, the trumpet, are just the first signs. The second poem I'll read is called Eve from Above. And this one sort of grew out of a fact that I learned from my friend Jeremy one summer when we were in McCarthy in Alaska. There are plants that if you step on them don't grow back for like 100 years called dryas. And Jeremy told me this like 10 years ago, and this fact had stuck in my head, the importance of not stepping on them, one, but also sort of the miracle of that fact, right? So thanks to Jeremy for telling me what this plant was when I texted him like 2 years ago while writing this poem to find out what it was. Again, Eve from Above. Enter dipping close to the mountains, the sheep bouldering their positions along the ridge. As long as you can feel the air pressing against the mirrored glass and engine rattle, the mountains must be on one side, the valley on the other, or else the image dies, or else the brush and purple flowers draw higher breath while the evergreens wait below. What does it mean to be patient? Even the needles clinging on in the breeze will let go, or the plant which, once tread, takes 100 years to reproduce its head. A woman walks the tree line, tracing it with her body, and down to the rocky bed of fish in spread formation, and back again to the flowers purpled by closeness to the sun. The hillside does not end, always pushing the outside world up and down on its shoulders, connecting again earth and sky. I guess this is the time when everyone arrives. The flowers grow as if they cannot see themselves, the fish after an origin that is not seeking them. You watching are like the paws reaching at them from above, muffled by the evening river's roll. You watching are like the rocks shaken loose from their beds, a swifter rain. A face above, just outlining its own moon. Braided river pulled strand by strand from its riverbank husk. When the woman bends into a drink of water from the stream, the mosquitoes fill her mouth. She cannot let them out. She will. The next poem is the one, as promised, that appeared in AQR, I think 2 or 3 years ago at this point. It takes its form from the self-portraits in Jory Graham's book, The End of Beauty, and it is in 12 parts, although I will not tell you when they are, so you'll just have to imagine that this poem is sort of in very short stanzas. It's called Self-Portrait as Cain and Abel. On the way to the field, one brother's step a little too light, the other's burdened. How does sin wait at the tent flap? In a rough squat, ready to seize, or with its feet up, tapping its cigarette ash into the soil? There are many ways to wait, one brother thought, selecting the place. There are many ways to give, thought the other, eyes lingering along the low stone wall marking the path. The problem was too loud, too quiet, too nervous, too presumptive. One saw it in the other's boots. The other saw it in the sheep bleating reliably. They were good-looking sheep, fluffy and so on. Can one really be blamed because the earth bears hard and rude forms? Warded squash, carrots like elongated toes, the settling weight of pears. Oh, they are beautiful too, among the most. But might he not have needed a respite from the politics of fruit? The sheep stood scattered in the field, repeating their little shouts. Was it spring, with the miniatures standing beside their mothers magnetically? Perhaps they had already gone off in search of whatever else there is. The brothers have almost reached the field. Right. The last poem I'll read to you is one more with an Alaska connection. In it appears a dear friend of mine who was my next door neighbor in Anchorage, who studies loons for the USGS. Loons, the bird, right? And this one's called Vanitas. Did the painters need a real skull, or had their lives been so marked with graves they could do it from memory? How if buried too close to the top layer in permafrost, the bodies just push back up. I've been thinking lately of Brian flat on his back across the tundra, reading a novel the night before his team heads out to tag loons, the headlamp letters of the book in a little green pup tent pulling him outside time, while all the night sky holds an open door. The wait the next day for the loons who, netted, weigh the sack of a handheld scale like a yolk slipping from an egg. It turns out there is no wait. One goes to the loons. And in this video, I find a team atop a lake nets again the birds, plops them one by one into a little buzzing whaler. The loons, apprehended, turn to the tight flashlight beam as it approaches, all eyes. Easier, the narrator says, to tell the banded individuals from the common species. What a narrow thing to be seen. I have said as much in spring to the daffodils elbowing up again where grass has tried to squat. For the loud arrival of everyone who, once seen, will die. I don't make the rules. I've been wearing overalls again, something to slip wholly into, like hearing geese outside and opening the door to find they've already spilled across the sky. In the house, someone sings to the baby, Sweet Caroline, at the table, where on her birthday the yellow formica spread with a dinosaur cloth. We followed, in numbers, the new life. See, ourselves, all is not lost, all is quiet. We still talk about them, which had short arms and fast legs, which cried, and which, like a gentle wave, rolled grasses into their mouths, crushed between teeth, swallowed wide. Thank you so much. I'll turn things over to our last reading.
Oh, thank you very much, Kate. And now it's Virginia's turn.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you so much to all the readers. It's just such a pleasure and honor to be reading with three poets and friends that I admire dearly. And thank you so much to Ron. I still remember the invite came several months ago, but and it gave me something to look forward to all year. And now we're here. It's a friend of mine said that the pandemic is characterized more by Kairos than Chronos. And I think that's true because every moment feels momentous when something's actually happening. So it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm so grateful to Ron and everyone that contributes to this amazing series. And I'm also going to start with a poem from Alaska Quarterly Review, a journal that I was so honored to be published in, as Heather said, a legend, or as we say in grad school, right? A dream journal, always a dream journal. And then I had two poems in there and I was absolutely thrilled. This one is from Any God Will Do. It's an erasure poem. I had this idea to write a chapbook of erasure poems from novels in the Western canon. I started with Madame Bovary, which is this poem. And I got through a couple more, and then I tried to tackle Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, and things got really derailed. And then, so I only had a couple of, not a chapbook, but Madame Bovary was the first one I started with, and it was published in AQR. And it's from the translation by one of my favorite poets and writers, Lydia Davis. Madame Bovary. Look at those pretty daisies. Oracles enough for any village girl who happens to be in love. Why rant against the passions? Aren't they the only beautiful thing on earth? The source of heroism, enthusiasm, poetry, music, the arts. How bored I am. How bored I am. A surgeon's caresses are like the oil with which he greases his scalpel. When I lost my poor dear late lamented, I would go down into the fields to be all alone. I would fling myself down under a tree. I would weep. He liked hard cider, a rare leg of lamb, Gloria's well beaten. She would think of all the wild emotions unknown to her. Why hadn't she seized that happiness when it was offered? She would end by asking him to give her some tonic for her health and a little more love. Would this misery last forever? She grew pale and had palpitations of the heart. At other times, burning hotly with that secret flame, she would open her window, breathe in the cold air, and looking at the stars, long for princely loves. You're ungodly. You have no religion. A convulsion flung her back on the mattress. Here I am. I'm yours. I've just enjoyed doing that so much because of the shape-shifting of the narrative voices, and obviously just writing a erasure poem from a 18th or 19th century novel is just a delightful poetic conceit. I'm going to read a few poems from a book that's forthcoming in September from a press in Montreal called Vehicule Press. It's called Hallelujah Time. Yeah, these three poems are from that book. This first one, it's kind of a little bit of a mishmash between a complicated love poem, lapsed Catholicism, and teaching college composition. But it could also be a lapsed teaching composition poem, lapsed love poem, or complicated Catholicism. I'll let you be the judge. It's called L'air exquise. I've hurt you. I've loved you. I've vacuumed all the rooms. I have no idea what became of us, yet the possibilities for happiness are endless. Once, when my lover betrayed me, I greeted him at the door with a knife. Now I am on my haunches, unvalued and unused. Am I to be blamed for wanting absolution? Am I to be blamed for keeping what I conjure in a vial of formaldehyde beside my bed? Admiring crowd, death is my downfall. My students fail repeatedly to deploy the correct conjunctive adverbs in everyday speech. Consequently, I fold my napkin into a perfect square. Henceforth, the night ends so quickly, bringing forth the vulgar day. When images become inadequate, I shall be content with silence. When images become inadequate, I separate the chaff from the wheat. I feel I've learned so little here. The soul pressed flat is matter unsexed. The heart pressed flat is meat. This next poem is, I've translated a book of poetry from a Quebecois poet named Samuel Mercier called The War Years, which in French is Les Années de Guerre. And it's about the post 9/11 landscape and the beginning of the War on Terror, among other things, including Quebecois politics. And I took the conceit of the kind of borrowing the title and thinking more about the War on Terror and not knowing who or what the enemy is or where they're coming from, and the whole war on terror and domestic terrorism and the idea of the enemy, conceivably also being within and not just in an us them, us versus them, binary or dichotomy. So it's kind of about a relationship, but also about where do we look for the enemy or the friend. Les années de guerre. The past, yes, the past. Who was I then? My inner voice is getting kinder, but it's in enemy territory, a dueling body and mind. Life is poignant and cruel. Why are you staring at me? I'm not a clock, digital or analog. I'm a marsupial born in water, walked over by Jesus in Galilee. But who's counting his awesome miracles? I was happy peeling potatoes in the army, happy with my ration of butter and bread. Dramatis personae, all rise. Court is now in session, presided over by your honor and deed and name. Time is the essence of money, which is why I fail at both. Depth over breadth is the gospel I hiss infelicitously to the world. The thought you have after the thought you lose is the saddest thought ever. And yet hope is the thing with feathers that perches atop the combat vehicle. Who reminds repetition of repetition? What is the antidote to territorialism, binding men to evil like glue? Me? I reject all domestic certainties. I've never wanted to be anywhere but here, in the still pool of total war, caught in the crosshairs with you. And I'll just read a couple more. This one was a challenge at a party. Someone asked me what my favorite literary device was. And I said, tautology. And they said, why don't you write a poem about it? And this is what happened. It's called Hard Night. Then came with time a sort of deadening. Then came the birds that woke me, dishabille, while I was dreaming of satiety, gaiety, the blood of my boot-black heart. People are people, but the world feels elegiac somehow now. If I perish, said Esther. And if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. It's deja vu all over again. The undecideds cannot make up their minds, and our nation must come together to unite. Part of the problem is lexicon, the different ways we describe, or is that experience, the mistral breeze. A tautology is true by definition. It has no possibility of being false. We ask from God what we ask of art to be changed. We ask to be more than a frantic bleats enduring a steady rhythm of whips. What is there to say of earth? It seeks redress, but silently. Who can translate the forked tongue of the plow, the lathe, the scythe? I am not a man-made implement. This, the autobiography of a life. I never sent it to that friend who challenged me to write a poem about my favorite literary device, and I should. I'll just read two very short ones from my most recent chapbook. It's called That Tree Is Mine, from a Nova Scotia press called Gasborough that I was delighted to publish with. This poem is called Romanticism. It's just a few lines long. It was inspired by thinking about John Keats' training as a medical doctor while also being kind of, a paragon of Romanticism and how that would affect his way of thinking about the heart. Romanticism. The heart does its own bidding, is more than just a pump, but it needs a storyline beyond failure, triple bypass, attack. The bathers don their sealskin caps, dive into ice cold water, and thus the heart is electrified, awoke. Without pacemakers, millions would be dead. Art wields a scalpel, silence wields a knife. I place a wreath of antlers in your hair, declare us forest and wife. And the last one I'll read is called Testament. Again, going back to that lapsed Catholicism and my desire to believe. Testament. I want to turn the night into a feast. I want rosemary flecked potatoes, seafood paella, and chilled sorbet. I want chandeliers on every fence post, signaling disposable income or the sudden liquidation of assets. I will look into hair extensions, eyelash extensions, and fake nails. Does silicone float, sink, or sail? Draperies made of gold damask, floors of old-growth redwood, aquariums filled with exotic fish. I want a mirage, but unpeopled, without staff. When it dissolves, I will be alone again, a believer at last. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much, Virginia and Kate, Alyse, and Heather. Our hour is up, but I just can't help having all of you here. I really appreciate your time, and I know you're all busy. It sounds like things going on, so I won't keep you too long and in different time zones. But I thought maybe just before you go, and I know this is a long topic, but just a short little thought on it. You all have influences, some more than others, from Elizabeth Bishop, and she spoke a lot about the unconscious in poetry, and how like it, both in the writing of it and in the listening of it. And I just thought, as our literary part of the series ends, if you had any thoughts on that, when she says that poetry should be unconscious, but then also in the hearing of it, we should just let it happen and let our unconscious soak it up. But if you don't want to talk about that, you don't have to either. You can just talk about whatever you want. I did, Heather, I was going to tell you something that I actually, one of my daughters was born in a call too. So there's that. So that I actually pushed out a baby with all the stuff on her. So, which is probably more than you want to know, and it might not be a poem. But anyway, if you all want to just talk about just that idea of the unconscious in creative work and in your poetry, just for a second, even just among yourselves.
Sure. Heather, it's great to meet someone else who's given birth to someone in call. That's amazing. I now know two people for whom it's happened. So maybe if I keep reading this poem, I'll collect more. I think, one thought that I have about Bishop's interest in the unconscious She's this wonderful anecdote that I think all four of us are familiar with. She had read somewhere that the eating of sharp cheese before you go to bed at night could produce particularly vivid dreams. And she was very, very interested in her dream life. She wrote quite a bit about her dreams in her notebooks, and tried to see if this cheese would induce fantastical dreams. It seems from some of the surrealism in her early work, it may have been the case. I think what's interesting to me and part about poetry and the unconscious is how that, at least for me, involves sound, in as much as poetry, I think with its emphasis on the musicality of language, can pack in a kind of semantic surplus or super sense, in as much as I think the language can sometimes communicate to the body something visceral that extends beyond the strict semantic content of the words or meaning on the page. Whatever's, to borrow the new critics, irreducible to paraphrase, that sort of spooky sense that poems can have, that sort of tickles the unconscious or enlivens the body, I think, to a certain extent. So those are my thoughts. Cheese and music, primarily.
Anybody else want to jump in?
Sure, I'll jump in. I mean, I think of these folks, I'm the one who's the least up on the Bishop's scholarship. So I'll diverge from what Heather has said delightfully about the cheese and just say that I think that for me, through my reading of Bishop's poems, that I think of how the unconscious can come into play in the writing almost as a way of sort of unleashing the mind within the parameters of the poem, and then figuring out how to make space within that structure through sound and through sort of exploring all the possible ideas at the boundaries. You might, so someone told me once that listening to my poems is sort of like listening to like a monkey or a lemur jump back and forth side to side in a cage, like at a zoo. I think that is probably a pretty accurate representation of the way my brain works when writing poetry. But I always think of Bishop's observation as a way of not only using poetry as a practice of attention, but thinking of how it can then set the mind loose on its process of inquiry, whatever that's going to end up to be. And that should be surprising to the poet, whatever it is.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there to just contribute my favorite Elizabeth Bishop fact, which is her really useful definition of poetry as something requiring spontaneity, accuracy, and mystery. And she had an apocryphal pet toucan named Uncle Sam that's possibly a nod to that, belief of that the poems needed those three qualities. And I think that the triangulation of those three factors, not only in her work, but just in poetry in general, is what, for me, unleashes the unconscious mind, is a sense that the poet is exploring genuine questions, using accurate details and observations. Bishop's most surreal poems are still always tethered to what she notices and her details. And it's just been a really useful teaching tool for me, to be honest, too, to go in and talk with my students. I've designed whole workshops around this idea of spontaneity, accuracy, and mystery. And it feels like a really cool recipe to share with beginning poets and experienced poets. And so that kind of brilliance masked by seeming simplicity in this pedagogical tool, which you've never intended as a pedagogical tool, which was just writing an essay about poetry, to me, like, really characterizes Bishop's approach to writing in general.
I'll just add to that. I love the idea of, evoking memory or evoking, narrative experience or narrative detail, in Bishop's poems, specifically through just the practice of writing and the practice of journaling or writing down and just being an acute observer of life. I'm reminded of that Emily Dickinson line too, as well. Tell the truth, but tell it slant. I feel like sometimes when I'm in a moment where I'm writing a poem, I'm almost looking askance from the subject matter. And I think a lot of great poems can come from remembering iotas of our experience or recalling iotas of our experience, but also, also being very attuned to, our visceral, everyday reality and just the practice of it. This, I think, I'm not a Freudian, but I think a lot of, exciting language comes from almost linguistic mistakes or, ways of speech that we don't ordinarily practice in our normal, day-to-day, the parole of life. So I think priming the pump by, being an observer of life and journaling and writing down jots and notes and things that you think don't constitute real poems can all work toward, enlivening the unconscious mind and in the conscious production of poetry.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you all for being here so much. What a day. I want to already go back and watch the YouTube. So, and also thank you again for joining us today on the final event of the literary part of our series. And on behalf of the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, all our gratitude and generosity, of course, go to today's writers, also to Rebecca Pottebaum and Cody Carver at the Anchorage Museum at the Rasmussen Center, who produced this program. And really, thank you, Gunachish, again, to all of you that helped reach our fundraising goal. And also, the best way, remember, to support the poets like we've heard today and your favorite writers is to buy their books at or order them through your local bookstore. They'll get them for you, or subscribe to a journal like Alaska Quarterly Review, of course that one, but there's many others. And that's one of the best ways that you can support poets and writers. And Ron, as always, the last word is yours.
Well, let me thank you, Heather. You're an amazing, fine writer in your own right. And now that we've done our 20th event of this special series, we could say to you, to mean a long time, that you devoted a month of Sundays, but actually you devoted 8 months of Sundays, which when you think about that commitment, it's pretty amazing. So I thank you for your grace and your intelligence and your support of Alaska Quarterly Review. Thank you, Virginia Konchan, Kate Partridge, Heather Tressler, and Alyse Knorr, for not only supporting us, but providing this beautiful, meaningful reading today. And so next week, it's not entirely not literary, but it's a combined event. It's our CODA event for our 40th anniversary series. We will have another series, by the way. The museum has already signed off. We will have another one beginning in the fall, but it won't be our 40th anniversary series. That's what this one is. And so it's called Literary Milestones to Cornerstones. It will include readings by poet Danusha Lamaris and short story writer Manini Nayar. And it will also include a panel conversation about what the literary landscape might look like in the post-pandemic future. The panel will be led by Anchorage Museum CEO Julie Decker, and will include our readers, myself, and acclaimed essayist and author of 6 books, Danielle Offrey, who is the co-founder of the Bellevue Literary magazine, journal, which, like AQR, is celebrating a literary milestone this year. It's their 20th anniversary. And I thought that would be a really cool thing from a perspective of both of us, what that's like going forward and what the challenges are going forward. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us now and in the past. As Heather said, these are all available on YouTube. We're building up a big commitment to literary arts there. It's going to be amazing to visit and spend time on that channel. And so thank you for today. And I look forward to all of